We're in a series, and we're calling it Living the Dream. And what we're learning in this series is that God has a dream for every person. Every person, if you're a Christian, God has a dream for your life. And the thing is, most of us live with the dream, but we never experience the dream. And the reason we don't experience the dream is because our character won't support the dream. And so what we're learning is God has to go to work in our lives once we become Christians, once he puts that calling on our life, what he wants us to do with our life. By the way, the dream and the calling that God has put on your life, nobody else can do it for you. Nobody else can replace what God wants you to do. I can't do it for you. You can only do it. And so it's important that we follow through, but God has to go to work and build our character, because our character is what's the foundation that supports the dream, the calling, the purpose that God has for each one of us. And so we're learning this by looking at the life of David, and we're discovering that David pretty much went through all the same kind of tests that we deal with in life. For example, the first week we looked, he had to deal with his pride. God told him that one day his brothers and then his brothers and his mom and his dad, they were all going to bow down to him. And Joseph was only 17 years old, and that kind of went to his head. And we saw that caused all kinds of problem. And not only that, his dad gave him that beautiful coat of many colors, and he had a lot of pride that he was the favorite. And so he had to deal with that test. He had to grow from that test experience. And then we discovered that the brothers hated him so much, well, they threw him in a pit. They were going to kill him. They threw him in a pit and sold him into slavery. And he had to deal with the pit test. And we all have been in situations in our life where we just feel like we're in a pit. Maybe sometimes we got there on our own. Maybe sometimes we had nothing to do with it. Maybe we were a victim of circumstances, but we're in the pit. And what is it that God wants to teach us while we're in the pit? And how do we get out of the pit? And all of these are available on YouTube. You can go back and look at it. Last week we talked about the prosperity test. And this is not a prosperity gospel that God wants everybody to be rich, but it does say over 60 times in the Old Testament that God desires to prosper us in whatever we do. In other words, if God has called you to do something, he wants to prosper you in that area. And so we talked about how do we prosper, how do we do these things, and there were 4 key elements that you can look at it next. You can go to YouTube and look at it. Now, we're going to pick up the story this week in Genesis 39. If you don't have the app, the Be Renewed app, I'd encourage you to get it. All the notes, the text I'm going to be talking about this morning are there. But let me give you a little bit of background. We know that Joseph was thrown into the pit. They decided not to kill him. The brothers decided not to kill him. They decided to sell him to a bunch of Ishmaelites, and they took Joseph down to Egypt, and they sold him into slavery. He was purchased for 20 shekels of silver by a guy named Potiphar. So he goes to work in Potiphar's house as a slave, as a servant. But this is what Potiphar realizes. He realizes that God was with Joseph and that Joseph prospered in everything he did. We talked about that last week. But he also noticed that his whole household prospered just because Joseph was there. And so Potiphar, it says, put Joseph in charge of everything. In fact, I think this part of the sentence we looked at in verse 6 was the only thing that Potiphar concerned himself with was what he was eating at that moment. Joseph ran everything else. He took care of the bills. He made sure the electricity didn't get cut off. He made sure the kids got to school. He did everything for Potiphar. That's the kind of reputation that Joseph had. But then we pick it up in verse 6 of Genesis chapter 39. It says, Joseph was well built and handsome. And right away, you know that's a red flag, okay? The fact that, every time you read God describing someone in the Bible like she was beautiful and intelligent, okay, something interesting is coming, right? So Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while, his master's wife, this would be Potiphar's wife, took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. And again, not to take a nap, but he refused. He said, with me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And though he spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day he went to the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. Verse 13, when she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand, think coat, okay, and ran out, she called her household servants, verse 14. Look, she said to them, this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. So she falsely accuses him. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. By the way, I noticed a little trend here. It seems like every time Joseph's life goes south, it involves a coat. First, it was the coat of many colors, and his brothers hated him for it. And now it's just a coat he happened to be wearing around Potiphar's house. If I was Joseph, I would have such PTSD, I would never put on a coat the rest of my life. It could be 20 degrees and shivering. People are probably saying, Joseph, you want a coat? No, I'm fine. No coats whatsoever, right? But then it says in verse 16, she kept his cloak beside her until his master, Potiphar, came home. Then she told him this story. The Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When the master heard the story of his wife, the story his wife told him, saying, this is how your slave treated me, he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph, we see this trend again. While Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. Then verse 23, the warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. And we talked about that last week, but this is the perseverance test. And this is what we're going to be talking about this weekend. How do you handle life when you do what you're supposed to do? In other words, you do the right thing, but you end up suffering for it. How do you handle those situations? I'll give you a good example. Let's say that your boss calls you into the office and says, man, we have got to close this deal. But what I need you to do, I need you to fudge some numbers a little bit, or I need you to say this, or I need you to take this position. And you know deep down inside your integrity will not allow you to do it. And so you tell the boss, I can't do it. And then a few months later, mysteriously, for some reason, you end up losing your job. How do you handle a situation like that? Or here's one of my pet peeves. James chapter 5 says, if you're a Christian, he says, if you sin, confess your sin to one another, and you'll be what? You'll be healed. In other words, it's part of that therapeutic process. What do you do when you sin, maybe against someone, and you think, okay, I'm going to apply the biblical principle, and so you go to them and you tell them exactly what you did to get their forgiveness. And you find out the next day that there's a bunch of people that know about it. And not only that, the person you confessed to is now using it against you. What do? You did the right thing, but you're suffering because of it. Or what do you do when somebody lies about you and everybody believes it and there's no way to defend yourself? And then what do you do if it's not over in just a few days? What if you do if the suffering continues? Because as you're going to see, Joseph was in prison for this, falsely accused, but he was in prison for a long, long time. How do you handle that situation? Are you going to trust God? Are you going to continue to follow God? Or are you going to turn your back on God and walk away and say, you're just not here for me? So that's the perseverance test. By the way, I think a lot of us believe that when God delivers us from a difficult situation, once we get out of that situation, we're going to leverage that situation for God. We're going to do something great for God. I mean, how many times we say, man, if I ever get out of this, what a great story I've got to tell. And God's going to use this story. Well, the perseverance test is when you do something great for God while you're still in a circumstance that you're in unjustly or unfairly. How do you survive that time? How do you walk through that time? So that's what we're going to talk about. Now, Paul has addressed this in Romans chapter 5. So that's where we're going to go this morning. Romans chapter 5, verse 1. And we'll come back to the story of Joseph. But this is what Paul writes. Therefore, since we have been justified through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have gained access by faith into this grace in which we now stand. And we boast in the hope of the glory of God. Kind of hang on to the word glory there. Not only so, but we also glory. Same word, hang on to it. We also glory in our suffering. Now, if you have a New American Standard, that's translated tribulation. The same word that's translated suffering in the New Testament is also translated tribulation. I like tribulation better. And so we're going to go with that today. Because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, and by the way it's written in the Greek language, the word produce carries all the way through the sentence. Literally it says, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance produces character, Character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame. And this is I love the NIV, but this is one of the places they should have just left the word alone. If you have the New American Standard, it says hope does not disappoint. And I'll tell you why it's so critical that that's the word that we think about. Same Greek word, and you can use it for shame, but the translation here is better if it does not disappoint. Now, the reason I said I wanted you to notice this word glory is because there are two Greek words that are used in the New Testament that are translated glory. The one that's used the most is doxa, D-O-X-A. It means nothing to you, but you probably have used it before because you've sung the doxology, okay? The beginning of that word is the doxology. It means the glory of God. Literally, it means the shining glory of God. If you were to look at God, it's what you see, the doxology. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. That's not the word that Paul uses in Romans chapter 5. The word that he uses that he translates rejoice, it's from a word that means glory, but it's translated rejoice several times in the New Testament. The word doxa is used 138 times in the New Testament. This is not used very often, but it's translated not just glory, but it's also translated rejoice. This is what Paul is saying. We rejoice in our tribulation and suffering. Well, what's even more interesting, the root of this word that's translated rejoice is pray and wish. So we pray and wish for tribulation and suffering. Why in the world would anybody in their right mind pray and wish for tribulation and suffering? Well, it's because Paul says you rest assured in the fact that you know that tribulation produces perseverance. And let perseverance continue to work, and it's going to produce character. And then character is going to produce hope. And Paul tells us here that hope doesn't disappoint. Now, I don't know about you. Rarely do I wish and pray for tribulation and suffering. And I can almost guarantee you I have never rejoiced when I found myself in a situation of tribulating. When you tribulate. That's what I mean, just when that suffering that's going on. But that's what he's saying. And the reason he's saying it is because of what suffering and tribulation produces. Now, why is this so important? Well, I've been saying from the beginning of this series, if we don't have the character in our lives, that character will not support the dream, the purpose that God has for us in our lives. But now Paul comes along and says, okay, but in order to develop character, it starts with perseverance. And once we have perseverance, then we have character. And he goes right through the process. But he says, if you're going to get it, you got to go through the suffering and the tribulation. And so I want us to see why God gives us this process and how we handle this process that God is going to put us through, because he's going to put us through it. So they come right out of Romans chapter 5. First of all, tribulation produces perseverance. It produces perseverance. By the way, let me just say this. You do not have to pray and wish for suffering and tribulation in life. It will find you. It will find you, okay? This is what Jesus said in John 16, verse 33. In this world you will have trouble. It's the very same word that's translated tribulation, the same Greek word. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. James says it this way in James chapter 1, verse 2. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces patience. By the way, what's the difference between a trial and a tribulation? Well, a trial is short. A trial is brief. A trial is when you're standing in the 10 and under items at the grocery store, and the person in front of you has 31, right? And most of the QR codes are missing, right? That's a trial. It's brief. You're going to get past it. You know what my pet peeve is? I'll share this with you. When I go to Walgreens to drop off a prescription or pick up something, and I go to the outside line, because if you're right up there, they got the little drawer that comes out, that you're cool. But if you go to the outside, they got the little canister you put in there, it sucks it up, and then it sends it back to you. When I pull up and that canister's not there, I am ticked off. I'm like, why did you send it back? Why didn't you just leave it for the next person? Now I got to wait for them to get around to send the canister back. So if you're not smart enough to understand this stuff, go inside to get your prescription, right? By the way, you can see I am a very patient person, and I have great victory in this area of my life when it comes to patience. But a trial is short. A trial is brief, and it requires patience. But understand, patience isn't just waiting. It's not just waiting and being irritated. This is literally the Greek definition for it. Patience is waiting with contentment through a brief trial. I mean, it's waiting there for the canister to come back and you're whistling worship songs or looking at how beautiful God's creation is. It's waiting with contentment. That's a trial. On the other hand, a tribulation, and this is what is going to build perseverance, a tribulation is a long, drawn-out process. And because it's a long, drawn-out process, tribulation requires perseverance. What is perseverance? Perseverance is fighting the battle while you're waiting with contentment. Let me say that again. It's a long, drawn-out battle. It's fighting the battle while you're waiting with contentment. In other words, perseverance is an extended war. It's a war. So a trial, it's brief. It requires patience. A tribulation is long. It requires perseverance. That's the difference. But here's my point of sharing that with you. Perseverance doesn't come in a week. I'll give you an example. For Joseph, he was in prison 13 years. 13 years. How about David? From the time that David was anointed to be the king of Israel until he was crowned the king, he spent years running from Saul, trying to stay alive. How many years? 13. 13. I don't know what it is about 13. Paul had to spend 13 years in the church at Antioch before he ever went on his first missionary journey. 13 years. Where you're like, my tribulation is a lot longer than 13. Okay? Abraham, 25 years. 25 years. Well, mine's longer than that. Well, Moses, 40 years. Well, I mean, I'll keep going with you, but Moses had to wait 40 years. He had to persevere. By the way, aren't you glad you came today? Aren't you encouraged, that things are going great? But anyway, my point is simply this. We are going to go through suffering in life. We are going to go through tribulation. But Jesus said, hey, don't worry about it because I've already overcome it. I've already taken care of it. What does he mean by that? Well, it's interesting. One of the things you'll see as we study the life of Joseph, Joseph never got bitter at God. He never got bitter at his brothers. In fact, we'll see this play out in just a few weeks. He never got bitter at the Egyptians. We don't read anything that he ever got bitter at Mrs. Potiphar for framing him and him ending up in prison for 13 years. Do you know why? It's because tribulation, that long, difficult time of suffering, it produced perseverance in his life. Here's a second. Perseverance produces character. By the way, I did a little research and I looked up this idea of character. And the word character only appears a few times in the entire Bible. I could not find one verse. I could find nothing else in the Bible that specifically said this will produce character. I couldn't find another verse anywhere that said this will produce character. Wouldn't it be nice if there were? Wouldn't you love to find a verse that says if you want character, have your family pray for you and you will get character, right? But according to the Bible, that's not how it works. Perseverance produces character. That means that if we want character, we're going to have to learn how to persevere. And what builds perseverance? Tribulation and suffering. And you hear that and you think, that's not a great formula. I mean, God needs to work on his marketing ideas, right? But here's the thing. This is it. Which means whether we like it or not, or approve of it or not, we have to deal with it. And if you can learn to persevere through trials and suffering, it is going to build character in your life. But here's the thing. For that to happen, each one of us, we have to go on that journey. And there are no shortcuts. There are no shortcuts. I love to help people. Just like you, I have a few spiritual gifts. So somehow God wired us, and it's one of the things God wired me. I have a high level of mercy for people, and I have a high degree of if I see somebody in need, I want to help them. And I've actually tried to live my life by the principle in James chapter 2, where James says, if you see your brother in need, if they're cold, if they're hungry, don't say go warm and be filled, and pray for them. He says, if you can help them with their need, help them, right? In fact, what I've learned in life, many times when God lays something on my heart, I actually realized I was the answer to that person's need. And so I didn't even often pray for it. I just did it. But this is what I learned over time, and I learned it the hard way. I learned that there were times where me helping people was actually crossing over to enabling. In fact, there have been times where I look back and I realized I'd made a big mistake. So I didn't now I don't just initially act. I do spend a little time praying because, see, I know now that the worst thing I can do is to step in and deliver a person out of a tribulation that God is trying to use in their life to produce character. So I've learned even when you're trying to help people, you have to be very, very, very careful. And often I'll pray now, God, what do you want me to do? I'm aware of the situation. What do you want me to do? You've given me the financial means. You've given me the time. You've given me the energy. What do you want me to do? Because I want to know, what are you doing in this person's life? Because I don't want to circumvent what God is trying to do. And what God is trying to do is much more important than what I think is important. So you have to be very, very careful. Now, if you were here last week, this is what we saw. We saw that everywhere Joseph went, he became a person of great responsibility. We're going to see in a couple of weeks, he became a person of great means. But he had great responsibilities, and everything he did prospered. But I think in this situation, as Joseph was going through this test, I think he made a mistake. Because if you know the story, and we'll talk more about this next week, while Joseph was in prison, now he's been put over the prison, right? While he's in prison, Pharaoh has a falling out with his cupbearer and his baker. So he sends them to prison for a while. And Joseph is over them. And one morning, Joseph sees them, and he seems like they're sad, depressed, downcast. And he said, what's going on? They said, oh, man, we had some freaky dreams last night. It's probably the melatonin. But they had some weird dreams, right? And so the cupbearer said, this is my dream. And the baker said, this is my dream. And Joseph said, well, I can interpret those dreams for you. And he says to the cupbearer, listen, don't worry about it. In 3 days, you're going to be restored back to your position at the palace. But then you look at the baker, not such good news. In 3 days, you're going to lose your head. And so he interprets the dreams for these guys. And then after interpreting the dream, Joseph says to the cupbearer, hey, listen, dude, I just interpreted your dream. Don't forget me. When you get back to the palace, okay, when you're back around Pharaoh, don't forget me. Put in a good word for me. In fact, it says this in Genesis 40, verse 14. He says, but when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness, mention me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this prison. Did you notice how many times the word me appeared there? Remember me, show me, mention me, get me out. And I think that when God heard that, I think he may have thought, well, I'm really impressed with Joseph in prison, but yet he's still trying to help other people, right? But I also think that God thought, you know what? I think Joseph could use a couple more years in the slammer. And I say that because it was 2 years after this happened that the cupbearer finally got around to remembering Joseph. By the way, you'll notice he didn't say that to the baker. He didn't say to the baker, remember me. Why didn't he do that? Well, remember his interpretation of the baker's dream? He's going to lose his head. Well, it's hard to remember anything when you don't have a head. So he didn't even bother to say that to the baker. He just said it to the cupbearer. But sure enough, the cupbearer, in 3 days, he goes back, he gets promoted back to his position, and it says in Genesis 40, verse 23, the chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph, and he forgot him. I actually believe that Joseph could have been released from prison 2 years earlier. But because Joseph tried to manipulate the situation, I think God looked at him and thought, he hasn't passed this test yet. He's not ready yet. In fact, if I let him out now, he's just going to think that his way to get ahead of life is through manipulation. I need to give him a little more time. My whole point is, when you find yourself in a situation like this, and we all find ourselves in these situations, God does not reward manipulation. One of the things I've struggled with for years when I was pastoring and had big staffs is to watch the young people that work for me clawing and manipulating and sometimes changing stories to make their way up the ladder. And I'm thinking, boy, if that happens in church, I can't imagine what it's like in the real world. I know people right now that are in positions of leadership, and they're only in positions of leadership because they manipulated situations to put themselves in a position to be in leadership. And you probably know people like that where you work. But I'm telling you, God does not reward manipulation. We have to let God reward us when he's ready to reward us. I mean, go back to the story of David. Remember the story of David? We did the series, and David is being run out of Jerusalem by his son Absalom, and Absalom pulls a coup, and he's running his dad out of, and as they're leaving, remember Joseph and his household's packing up all the donkeys and the horses and getting all the belongings, and sure enough, his followers, they get the Ark of the Covenant. Why? Because you got Ark, you got God, and whoever has the Ark wins. Like we'll leave our kids and our pets, but we're not leaving the ark, right? We're taking the ark with us. And as they're making their way out of Jerusalem, David looks over and he sees the ark and he says, send it back. Send it back. I'm not going to manipulate this situation. If God wants to restore me and bless me, he'll restore me and bless me. If he doesn't want to restore me and bless me, he won't restore me and bless me. But I'm not going to manipulate the situation. I'm going to leave it up to God. So to be honest with you, Joseph, he didn't pass this test yet, right? 2 years later, Pharaoh finally had his dream. He called everybody in the court in. Hey, I need somebody who can interpret this dream. Nobody can interpret the dream. And then finally the cupbearer said, wait a second, I remember this guy. Was it Jack? John? James, Joseph, there's a guy in prison right now, sitting there in prison. He interpreted my dream. I bet he can interpret your dream. And Pharaoh, he sends for him, and that's when Joseph got out of prison. Now think about this. Maybe you've never thought about this before. Who gave Pharaoh his dream? It was God. Well, why else did God wait 2 years? When the cupbearer got released, he could have given him the dream the next week. He could have given him the dream that night. And the cupbearer was like, well, listen, I just got out of prison yesterday. I got a guy who can interpret your dream. God waits 2 years. Why? I think it was to teach Joseph this simple lesson that we have to learn, that you do the right thing regardless of the circumstances. You just do the right thing. And you don't manipulate me ever. You just do the right thing. So perseverance produces character. Here's the third one. Character produces hope. Now, I need to explain something about hope. There is a famous verse in the Bible that people have quoted to me a million times. Most time it's quoted out of context. It's Proverbs 13:12. It says, hope deferred makes the heart sick. Someone ever quoted that to you? Maybe you've used it yourself. Hope deferred, like you're hanging on to something, and after a while it just wears you down. It makes your heart sick. Well, if you look at it from that perspective, that is a true statement, but most people don't know the context of Proverbs 13. I used to have a seminary professor when I was at Talbot, and he would say this: a text taken out of context is a pretext. And what he was saying this: you can take any verse in the Bible, take that one verse, take it out of its context, and you can make that verse say anything that you want it to say. And so one of the things you learn in seminary is that when you see a verse, you have to take it in the context of the chapter. So at least take the time to read the entire chapter. But not only that, you have to ask yourself, is it congruent? Is it line up with? Does it agree with the entire Bible? That's how you decide the context of a verse. So here's the context of Proverbs 13:12. And I'm gonna go back in a few weeks, and I'm going to start the series where I start in Genesis and Exodus, and we're going to start working our way and getting an overview of the Bible so you can see how it all fits together. And one of my favorite ones is the book of Proverbs. And there are several different kinds of Proverbs, but Proverbs chapter 13 is a chapter of contrast. It has a statement, but when you see but, you know it's a contrast. It's a whole, if I give you an example, Proverbs 13 verse 1. A wise son heeds his father's instruction, but a mocker does not respond to rebukes. Verse 2. From the fruit of their lips, people enjoy good things, but the unfaithful have an appetite for violence. Verse 3, those who guard their lips preserve their lives, but those who speak rashly will come to ruin. Proverbs 13:12 says, hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is a tree of life. But you got to understand, this is the context of the entire chapter. Now let's go back. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. You got to ask you a question. Is that true? Does that line up to agree? Is it congruent with the rest of the Bible? Well, we just read out of Romans chapter 5. No, that's not true. In fact, it's the opposite. Because Paul says in Romans chapter 5, verse 5, hope does not disappoint. It doesn't disappoint. So it's a contradiction. This would be, and I'm not going to get into Hebrew this morning, but this would be a better paraphrase of Proverbs 13:12, and you'll see why. Misplaced hope makes the heart sick. Misplaced hope makes the heart sick. In other words, let's say you're in a horrible circumstance right now. Okay, this is your tribulation you're in. If your hope is in that one day your circumstance is going to change, one day this is going to change, but the circumstance never changes, your heart's going to be sick. For example, if you're thinking you're really dealing with financial, it's just, and you're thinking one day God's going to deliver me. One day, God, I know I'm going to be wealthy. One God, at least I'm going to be solid financially. But if that circumstance never changes, and that's where you're putting your hope, you're going to have a sick heart. Or like one day God's going to lead me into a relationship and it's going to be the right person and I'm going to get married, okay? Because I've been burned in the past. That's where I'm putting my hope. You put your hope there and you never find that individual, your heart's going to be sick. Or we want to have a child so bad and one day I know God's going to pull off a miracle and we have a child. If that's where you're putting your hope, that your circumstances are going to change and they don't change, your heart's going to be sick. You're going to have a sick heart. So think of it this way. It's not deferred hope. It's misplaced hope. But think of it also. If your hope is in the God who is good and works everything out for your good, you're not going to have a sick heart. God, I don't know why I'm in this circumstance, and I don't deserve to be here, but you know what? I know you're good. And I know you told me in Romans chapter 28 that you're working all things out for my good. So God, that's where my hope is. See, it's a big difference. So tribulation produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character. Character produces hope. What does hope produce, or does it produce anything? Well, Paul says here that it doesn't disappoint. Now, to explain this, you're going to have to really stick with me now, because I'm going to have to give you a grammar lesson. I can see your eyes you're just glazing over. Oh, great. I got to give you a little, and some of you'll know this, but here's the fourth one. Hope produces appointments. Literally, it produces divine appointments. Now, let me explain to you why I said that. Romans 5:5 says, hope does not disappoint. When you see the prefix dis, D-I-S, at the beginning of a word, what does it mean? Okay, I know you know it, so I'll answer it. It's not, okay? So when this says hope doesn't disappoint, it's really saying hope doesn't not appoint. Hope doesn't not appoint. It's a double negative. Well, what do we know about double negatives? It makes a positive. Come on, people. I know you know this stuff. Where you guys raised, Durham? Come on. I went to Durham County schools and I know this stuff, okay? It literally says hope doesn't not appoint. It's a double negative. I went and looked up the definition of a double negative. When two negative elements are used to produce positive force. So if you have two negatives, it produces a positive. And so really what it's saying is hope appoints. And I put this up here because we have where I train people at the gym, we have a sign that says no whining. But guess what the problem is? It has a line through it. You know what that says? No whining. In other words, if you want to work out here, we need to hear some whining, right? It's a double negative, right? Okay? Is that clear as mud? So understand, since hope does not disappoint, then what does it mean? It means hope does appoint. So think of it that way. Hope does appoint. Now let me ask you another question. What's a disappointment? Literally a disappointment, and you can think of it in this terms, is a missed appointment. For example, if you get disappointed when something doesn't happen in your life that you thought was going to happen, it's a missed appointment. It didn't show up. For example, if you thought on January 1st you were going to get a raise, you were sure it was going to happen, but on January 1st it didn't happen, it's a missed appointment. You're disappointed. Or you didn't get that promotion, it's a missed appointment. Or that relationship didn't turn into a marriage. It's not a disappointment, it's a missed appointment. You missed that opportunity. Everybody got that? Right? Clear as mud? Okay. So this is what Romans 5 is saying. Tribulation produces perseverance in my life. Perseverance produces character in my life. Character produces hope in my life. And then hope produces divine appointments in my life. Now stick with me here. That's what Paul is saying in Romans chapter 5. But for that to happen, we have to get to the place where we make sure that our hope is in God, not the hope that one day my circumstances are going to change. It's in God, whether your circumstances ever change or not. Now let me take you back to the story. You can see this. Genesis chapter 40, verse 6. When Joseph came to them, this goes back to when the cupbearer and the baker in prison, the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So right away we see he's just not focusing on his own issues. He's noticing what's going on in the lives of other people. He's not just looking out inward, he's looking outwardly. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad?" So even though Joseph is in prison, he's still caring about other people. And again, they told him the dream. He interprets the dream. But think about it this way. Even though he had to wait 2 more years, okay, those dreams that he interpreted, eventually, that's what got him out of prison. My point is simply this. What got him out of prison wasn't him sitting in prison sulking and having a pity party about the situation he was in that he didn't deserve to be in. What got him out was his heart and his willingness to minister to other people. Now, I think that's kind of amazing. I mean, the fact that regardless of his circumstances, Joseph cared about others. It produced a divine appointment in his life, the cupbearer, that eventually allowed him to be promoted to the second most powerful position in the most powerful nation on the earth at that time. That appointment. So let me just say this. Maybe you're in the middle of a circumstance this weekend like Joseph. It's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. You don't deserve the situation you're in. And maybe somebody did something to you to put you in that situation, and you just can't get over it. And what you're doing is you're totally focused every moment of every day of the negative impact that that's having on your life. So let me just make a suggestion. Maybe if you were to turn your focus outward, Christians, I'm telling you, we suffer from ingrown eyeballs. Most of us do. We focus on our failures, our mistake, our situation, right? If you were to just turn your focus outward and start seeing what's going on around you and looking for opportunities to minister and love on people, God may just cause a divine appointment in your life that's going to deliver you. Now, let me just say this. We live in an escapism world. Right on the verge of a solution, often we run. We quit school. We quit marriage. We quit jobs. We just kind of take off. I mean, and I think right when God's ready to show up on the scene, we're gone, right? And I think often we miss that divine appointment. I had this conversation with my son yesterday, and it breaks my heart. He's my oldest, and I just love him to death. But honestly, because of what I did, part of the consequences of it is the fallout that he had to deal with. He had worked on staff with me for 14 years, not really ever for me, but on the staff. But once I left, even though he had done nothing wrong, the pressure to get him out was, so finally he just resigned. He still doesn't have a job. And he's in that area like, God, I don't understand. And we just had this conversation yesterday. And I was able to talk about this today. Like, this is God's got something for you, but this is the process of preparing your character for it. So you be patient, you pray, you do your part, and we'll see that next week. You do your part. But at the same time, you know, at the end of the day, God's going to show up at the right time. And I said it will probably be from a divine appointment. A divine appointment. It's amazing how God brings divine appointments. I'm embarrassed to say this, but 2 weeks ago, I was leaving the gym, and I went to open the door to my Jeep, and a bird swooped down. It's a bird that hates me, by the way. You would think a California condor was sitting in the tree above my car every day. So I moved it out from under that tree, and as I'm opening the door, the bird swooped down, and I jerked the door back, hit me right in the forehead. I don't know if you can see it right there. 2 hours later, I couldn't get it to stop bleeding. So I go to the emergency room. I'm like, I got to get some stitches. They give me some stitches, and I feel like the biggest idiot in the world. But while I'm sitting there, a lady comes in with a little machine. She said, I got to get some information. And she's kind of got this funny smile on her face. She said, I walked by the room and I saw you. She said, I knew it was you. And she said, I've been looking for you. And I said, oh, I have a Bible study at Ray. She was here last week, her and her husband. So I thought, well, that's kind of a divine appointment. You don't know what God's going to do in your life. And my encouragement to Aaron, just be faithful. You don't know. You don't know that phone call. You don't know who you're going to meet at Taco Bell. You have no idea where that divine appointment. But you just have to, how do you handle it in the situation that you're in? You probably heard of Corrie ten Boom, and I had the privilege when I was a very, very young man in California, right out of college, to hear her. But she traveled the world from the 50s to the 80s, 1980s, literally sharing with millions of people the message of forgiveness. Unfortunately, that message didn't come easily. It was born out of a time of tremendous suffering. She was a prisoner along with her sister Betsy in the Ravensbrück prisoner war camp during World War II. 92,000 ladies died in that camp. This is what she said to her sister on her deathbed. I don't know why God allows what he allows in our lives. All I know is that across the blueprint of our lives, God wrote the word Ravensbrück. Tell everyone you come in contact with that there is no pit so deep that God is not deeper still. This is what she says. They will listen to you because we have been there. Here's the bottom line. None of us get to choose what's written across the blueprint of our lives. But this is what we do get to choose. We do get to choose how we're going to respond. I have learned the difference in people's life. It's not the circumstances you go through. It's not what you have or you don't have. It's not even what you've done or what you don't do. The difference between people is how we deal with this journey that God takes us on that's called life. Now, the good news, by God's design, you get to choose. You get to choose. You can be bitter. You can see yourself as a victim. You can walk around with a chip on your shoulder, always having a sense of entitlement. Or you can be grateful and content, knowing that God has chosen this path for you. And this path includes tribulation and suffering. But it will lead to perseverance. And perseverance will lead to hope. And hope doesn't disappoint. But again, we all have that choice. We all have that choice.